We're here at Antigua Forum with Barbara Oakley. And Barbara, you're an international expert on education, and you're probably most famous for both writing a New York Times best-selling book on learning, and also a MOOC, a massive open online course. And I'm wondering what prompted your interest in teaching other people how to learn?
I think it was that I teach engineers, and for me, here's my shameful secret. I actually flunked my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science. I was terrible at them. And I was completely convinced that I didn't have the math gene, so to speak, and that wasn't something in my playbook. And then I liked language. I thought I could learn other languages, and so at that time there weren't inexpensive scholarships or anything like that, and so loans of any sort. So there was one way I could learn a language, which I really wanted to do. I wanted to learn another language and actually get paid for it while I was doing that, and that was to enlist in the Army. And so I did. I enlisted to learn another language, and I did learn another language. I learned Russian. And I ended up working out on the Bering Sea as a Russian translator for the Soviets during the 1980s. And the thing is, though, that ultimately I found that there just wasn't a big demand for Russian speakers. And I had the money that the military gave for retraining, and so I thought, why don't I see if I can retrain my brain? And I started trying to learn math and science because I could see that that's where the future was going. And if I'd known then what I know now, it would have been much, much easier. But there were tricks that I learned about learning. Some of it related to how you learn languages actually can help improve how you learn in math and science. And now I know the neuroscience behind why that's true. But one day, one of my students found out my sordid story of being an ex-math flunky and said, how'd you do it? How'd you change your brain? And I thought, I write books. Why don't I explore this idea? And that's where I started working out and writing about how really we know a lot from neuroscience now that can help bring us on board to learning much more effectively. And if you just learn these few simple tricks, it's not going to make learning easy, but it will make learning doable, even for really difficult subjects. And so that's what I set about to try to do with both the book, A Mind for Numbers, and the massive open online course, Learning How to Learn.
And MOOCs, they've become very popular both in developed countries and developing countries. What's your view on, or what role can MOOCs play, and especially in developing countries, when it comes to, for example, cost of education and access to education?
Oh, I think they're going to play an enormous role, and they are beginning to play an enormous role. Think about it. Developing countries didn't have the money to build massive telephone wire structures and so forth during the early days. But they were able to leapfrog over just using cellular systems once those came out. And it really, it was something that they didn't have to go through that sort of expensive intermediate period. And I think it's kind of that way with MOOCs, that all of a sudden there's an inexpensive technology that makes learning much more easily available. And so, let's use it. I was just in South Africa, and there were riots all over the country because students are demanding that fees must fall. And this is a simple, really good method for making good learning materials available for people if the MOOCs are well made. And just with the popularity of the MOOC that I did with Terence Sanowski, he's my co-instructor, he's the Francis Crick professor at the Salk Institute. Our MOOC is really popular. We have right now about 1.3 million students. who've enrolled in the course. And it just shows that if you do something well, that people will line up to take it, that they want to learn effectively. And so I think it's the MOOCs make for a competitive product. In other words, a classroom, a regular teacher is not going to have to worry too much that other teachers are going to steal their students, right? Because their classes fill up, and even if you're a terrible teacher, some students have to take your class. But for a MOOC, people don't have to take it, and people will gravitate towards the ones that are successful and really well done. I like to think that ours is a combination of academia meets Silicon Valley meets Hollywood. And so when you can capture that kind of excitement and with really solid and practical information that helps people, they just love it. So I think MOOCs are a great future for the developing countries, especially because of those enormous economies of scale that they provide. It can be free, and if you want a certificate, it can be very, very low cost. About the only problem that will need to be handled, and it's very easily handleable, and that is simply how do you have MOOCs? You need to just double check that the testing is valid and people aren't cheating their way through. And you know, they cheat their way through the regular school system, and some will try to do the same with MOOCs. But if you have a testing center or an online proctoring service, these kinds of things can be easily handled.
Besides MOOCs, what are the most interesting educational projects or experiments that you know about in the world right now?
Oh, let's see. Besides MOOCs, it's like saying, let's take the biggest thing off the table here. I guess the thing for me is my attention is really focused on MOOCs because I just see such enormous potential there and such enormous interest. The world in 2012, so 4 years ago, there were a handful of MOOCs, like literally a handful, and I suppose I'm overusing the word literally, but maybe a dozen or so MOOCs. And now there's over 4,000 MOOCs. So that tells you there's intense interest, and my guess is in the next decade there are going to be tens of thousands of MOOCs. And the best ones are going to make an enormous difference in helping people to learn effectively. So I have to admit my attention is just limited, and it just gets really centered on the world of MOOCs just because there's so much going on there.
And what's your thoughts on the criticisms of MOOCs, for example, that they take away teachers' jobs or their role in the classroom?
When printed books first came out, teachers got pretty upset about that because they were going to, people could actually learn through books, right? And if they learned through books, they wouldn't need teachers. The reality is we're always going to need teachers. What we do need more of, though, is more high-quality education. In other words, let's take South Africa. I mean, people are clamoring the students are clamoring for the opportunity to go to college, and they just don't have the infrastructure to scale up with the current amount of money they can spend. So with the same number of teachers using MOOCs, you can teach 5-10 times as many students. So it's not like you're cutting back on the number of professors you have. It's that you're able to scale up and use the teachers you do have much more effectively. In the long run, could it be disruptive to some extent? Perhaps. Although at the same time, you want to have, for example, if you're teaching an engineering topic, it's great to learn from a great teacher. And face it, I mean, statistically speaking, half of all teachers are below average. So we often talk about, oh, well, teaching in person is much better. But when they're saying that, they're imagining this hypothetical superstar, really good teacher. But actually, half of all teachers are below average. So chances are you could get a really crappy teacher. And so the thing is, what MOOCs do is they simply, they can make high quality instruction available, and then in a flipped class form, so you can get tutoring from a really high quality teacher, but then you can come and actively learn together with a really high quality in-person professor who you can actually work the problems together with. You're all working out some different examples. You can ask questions in class. It's a very active form of learning. And if you have this flipped format where you're using super high quality video materials coupled with in-person people who can help facilitate practice and kind of bring it to life in person, that's the best of all worlds. So I think that's something that it's important in the world of MOOCs. And here's another issue that I think is also important. People will sometimes say, well, MOOCs are just really, they're not that good because maybe you have 100,000 people sign up for a course and maybe 10,000 finish, maybe 5,000 finish out of that 100,000. Oh, they must be terrible. And the thing is, let's take your typical college textbook and let's count as starting the textbook as you touch it in a bookstore. Maybe 100 people touch in a bookstore. How many people actually work through every aspect of that textbook, all the chapters? We'll call those finishers. What percentage of people actually finish compared to those that have touched it when they started? Hardly any. So should we say that textbooks aren't really viable as a way of teaching because people don't finish them? Of course we wouldn't say that, but we do it with MOOCs because MOOCs have this way of measuring, of sensing when people have touched them, by registering so they can take a look at the materials and flip through the pages, so to speak. And so we get this misconception that MOOCs are terrible because people drop out, when actually textbooks are terrible. And if you took a course at the university and counted whether somebody clicked on it to read what the description is, well, that would be terrible too. So it's an artifact of how we were able to get the information of who clicked in interest, and so I think that a lot of interest in MOOCs, and also people teachers get these erroneous ideas that only people are really punctilious perfectionists who actually complete every aspect of the course, then I'll count them as a finisher. And that's the only one that really counts. But the reality is people watch some videos and they get a lot out of it, just like they read some chapters in a textbook because that's the ones that are taught, and they get a lot out of it. They don't have to finish every single thing to get a lot out of. So I think what I call sort of MOOC deniers, professors who are really looking for reasons not to like MOOCs, they have difficulty wrapping their minds around the idea that when you are, that you don't have to take every little aspect of a MOOC to get a lot out of it. So you don't have to finish it in order to still get a great deal.
And one of the insights in educational psychology is that we learn by experience and by doing. And what do you think, what kinds of experiences do we need to create to teach people about liberty, for example, which is a very abstract concept?
Oh, that is a great question. I think that part of it is, to my mind, liberty involves passion, it involves emotion, but it also involves reason. And one of the best things we can do to enhance people's understanding of liberty and to kind of help bring them on board is to enhance their ability to understand rational thinking. So often math, science, economics, understanding the foundations of these kinds of thinking patterns are really effective. And if someone goes through, and I've volunteered in school systems where sixth graders had never had homework corrected in their entire life. They could not, if you gave them 2 + 7, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. They couldn't do it. You can't fix bad math. If you have bad math education, K-12, through your first 12 years of schooling, you can't just patch that up with a little repair job of a class when you get to college. And people who don't have a good background in math and science, who have a terrible background, it's easier to seduce them with arguments that sound great. I'm going to give you a wonderful, you won't even have to work. The government's going to pay for everything. And it sounds good because they don't have that sort of grounding in understanding the math, the fundamentals of math. So to my mind, I think the most important thing that we can do to start building a better capability for people to understand understand liberty is to build a better foundation in rational thinking, in math and in science.
And one of your other interests besides education is altruism and pathological altruism. Can you describe what that is and also what's the psychology behind it?
Pathological altruism is my attempt to grapple with the idea that sometimes you can do things for other people and you truly have the best intentions. You truly want to help them. But because you're thinking emotionally rather than rationally or logically, and I'm not saying that everything can be quantified objectively, because when you come to a neuroscience perspective, that's pretty hard to pin down. There isn't really. But the thing is, when you're looking at how do you help others, you can be swayed by your emotions, and you can end up doing things that actually are harmful for other people. For example, you can give money to help support economic growth in Africa, but your donations are going to support dictators that actually continue with the really bad systems that are creating all these problems. So you're actually just continuing the problem when you're donating like this. Or in a more straightforward example, if you have a brother who's an addict and comes to you and always begging for money, and you give the money because you're emotionally you feel, oh, I've got to help that person, then you're not really helping that person at all. Although, of course, if you read the things like the National Enquirer, they love to sort of beat up on movie stars who have obviously had it up to here with a sibling who's a drug addict of some sort, and how could they possibly be so mean as to cut them off? But that's, again, that's that idea that doing the patently obvious thing is always helping, and often it's simply publicly signaling that you're helping, but it isn't really helping at all. So what I want to get at, people sometimes have the erroneous idea that altruism is always good. And it's just not. And sometimes it amazes me it's clear that helpful attempts there's even the old proverb, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But there's like something sacred to the idea of altruism. And as soon as you say, well, it's actually harming them, then they're like, well, that's not really altruism, except, oh, wait, yeah, that kind of was. But no, altruism can never be pathological, is how they kind of fall back to. So what I'm trying to do is kind of introduce this idea that it is safe, and in fact, it is helpful to understand that good intentions don't always result in beneficial outcomes for people. And if you really want to help, you often have to use both emotion and logic to see what the outcome is. They've done, there's a famous study of, in Brazil, an individual had a stroke and suffered from sort of pathological generosity. Couldn't turn it off, and caused a lot of problems for his family. So, our attempts to help others grows from our neurological underpinnings, and we need to be aware that we can get hijacked by as Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow, he calls it the fast thinking system, which is deeply emotional. We can get hijacked by that because that's faster. And sometimes, and if we're not trained with sort of that slower, more rational, let's follow up and see if this really makes sense to do that, then we can make mistakes. And of course, with modern society, we're sort of being provoked to do this kind of thinking, because there's a lot of follow your passion, right? It's do what your gut tells you to do. Don't think about it too much, and that way lies madness. And so what I'm trying to promote is it's good to have passions and feelings, but balance them with some good common sense and rationality as well.
Thank you very much, Barbara.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much.